Long before cities or written laws, food decided where people could live. Fresh meat and fish spoiled fast, so a successful hunt or catch created a new problem: waste. Then humans noticed something strange. Meat that touched natural salt stayed usable longer. Salt pulled out moisture, slowed rot, and bought time. It turned a single day of plenty into days, even weeks of meals. A scarce mineral became a survival tool. That change rewired movement. Groups that once had to follow animals and seasons could now plan. They dried strips of meat, packed fish in salt, and carried food farther than before. Winter shortages hurt less. Long trips became possible without constant hunting. A camp near a salt lick, a salty spring, or a coast stopped being just a stopover. It became an advantage worth returning to because it meant stored calories. Salt also created a new kind of map in people's minds. Certain places mattered more, not for game or shelter, but for preservation itself. When food could be kept, families could stay put longer, and gatherings could last beyond a single feast. Extra food supported more children and elders. It reduced the risk of starvation, but it also introduced dependence. Access to salt started to shape who ate well, who travelled, and who stayed. As the first river valley civilizations grew, salt stopped being something people merely found and started becoming something they made on purpose. Communities identified dependable sources and returned to them again and again. Along hot coasts and shallow lagoons, they laid out simple pans where sun and wind pulled water away and left crystals behind. Inland, they captured salty water from springs and marshes, then turned it into a planned, repeatable supply. Where the sun alone did not do the job, heat did. Brine got carried to hearths, poured into pots, and boiled until only salt remained. That work demanded fuel, tools, and time, so it pushed production into fixed places with routines. In other regions, people dug for it. They scraped it from exposed deposits or mined it from underground seams, then hauled it out in loads that could feed whole settlements. Once salt came from dedicated sites, it created a new kind of worker, specialists whose days revolved around one product. Farmers and herders still needed salt, but now they relied on someone else to provide it steadily. That dependence changed local power. Whoever managed the pans, the boiling pits, or the mine entrances controlled a choke point in everyday survival. Regular salt supplies supported larger populations, and shortages suddenly felt like crisis. Once communities depended on steady salt, distance became the next problem. Many people lived far from coasts, lakes, or mines. Local sources ran out or never existed, so movement turned into a system. Paths that once carried occasional loads became regular routes, linking interior villages to shorelines and deep salt deposits. Each trip solved a basic need. Each trip also proved something else. Salt could travel and demand waited everywhere. As those journeys repeated, specialists appeared. Some groups did not produce salt at all. They moved it. Merchants learned where brine was reliable, where roads stayed passable, where water and grazing kept pack animals alive. Small exchanges grew into caravans, timed to seasons, and guarded against theft. The logic was simple and hard to escape. Whoever managed transport decided who received salt first and who paid more when supplies tightened. Control did not always mean owning a mine. It often meant owning access. A narrow pass, a river crossing, a safe well, a place to store sacks until prices rose. These became power points. Networks formed around them with fees, favours and partnerships that pushed competitors out. Inland communities paid in grain, cloth, metal or labour because they could not bargain with the sea. Salt stayed the same mineral. the routes changed everything. As salt trade expanded, rulers faced a simple problem. Merchants moved wealth, but the state needed steady money, so authorities started measuring, recording, and charging. Salt, passing a bridge, entering a town, or leaving a mine met an official fee. At first, it looked like a small toll, but salt never stopped moving because everyone needed it. That made the tax unusually reliable, even when harvests failed. Then some governments went further. They did not just tax salt, they claimed it. A monopoly meant only approved producers could boil brine, only licensed traders could sell, and only stamped salt counted as legal. Private competition shrank. Prices rose in a controlled way. Most of all, the state turned a risky market into a predictable pipeline. Salt stopped being just a commodity and started acting like a public revenue machine. With that pipeline, rulers paid for things that lasted. Armies needed regular wages and rations, and salt taxes provided both cash and supply control. Roads became easier to justify because better transport increased salt movement and increased revenue again. Officials multiplied to enforce rules, check weights, and punish smuggling. The system fed itself. Once a state depended on salt income, it defended that income like territory. In China, the salt monopoly stopped being an improvised tax and became a machine. The court treated salt like a strategic resource, not just a seasoning. Officials set who could produce it, who could move it, and who could sell it. That mattered because everyone needed salt, and demand never disappeared. A government that controlled salt did not just collect money, it controlled a daily necessity. Control tightened through licensing. Instead of open trading, approved merchants received legal permission to handle state salt. Access became a privilege, and that privilege carried obligations. To track the flow, the government used salt certificates, documents that matched paid tax to a fixed amount of salt. A certificate turned salt into an accounted-for commodity. Without it, salt became contraband, and enforcement became part of ordinary administration. The system also depended on regional management. Different areas produced salt in different ways, so officials built local rules around local realities, then tied them back to the same central goal: steady revenue and predictable supply. When a dynasty managed the salt monopoly well, it funded armies and officials without constant emergency levies. When it failed, smuggling grew, prices jumped, and loyalty weakened. Salt policy became political survival. Around the Mediterranean, Rome expanded across coasts and inland plains, and one problem followed every conquest: feeding and holding an army together. Grain mattered, but salt quietly decided whether food travelled and whether it lasted. Meat spoiled, cheese failed, animals weakened. So Rome treated salt like infrastructure. Control of coastal salt pans and inland routes meant rations stayed edible, and marching columns stayed supplied longer than their rivals. As Roman forces moved, supply chains hardened into policy. Salt travelled on managed roads and by ship, and officials watched it the way they watched weapons. Taxes and fees followed the flow, because every sack could be counted and charged. That money returned to the state as predictable income, the kind that covered pay, contracts, and transport. Rome did not just win battles, it kept paying soldiers after the battles ended. Back in the capital, the same control helped a huge city keep eating. Rome pulled food from far away, but without salt, much of it could not be stored or moved safely. So the state's grip on salt supported more than legions. It supported urban life. When authorities kept salt steady, provisioning stayed stable, and power looked competent. When access tightened, prices rose fast. A basic mineral became a tool for expansion and control. In medieval West Africa, salt stopped being a simple seasoning and became a strategic resource. North of the Sahel, desert salt mines produced heavy slabs that people needed just to stay healthy in hot climates. South of the desert, gold came out of rivers and fields. The problem was distance. The Sahara stood between them. Caravans solved it, linking two worlds that needed each other. These crossings depended on camels, guides, and strict planning because a caravan that lost its way lost everything. Step by step, predictable routes formed, and along those routes, stopping points turned into market towns. Traders arrived to swap salt for gold, but also for grain and cloth. The exchange did more than move goods. It concentrated people, created city-states, and made trade the engine of political power. Once trade created wealth, it also created targets. Bandits threatened caravans, rival rulers tried to divert routes, and a single blocked crossing could starve a region of salt, so governments grew around protection. Leaders claimed authority by guarding wells, policing roads, and enforcing order at markets. Then they taxed what moved. Every load of salt and every pouch of gold became revenue, and that steady income held empires together. In early modern Europe, kings needed money more than ever. Wars expanded, courts grew, and governments demanded steady cash. Salt offered it. Everyone needed it all year, in every town, rich or poor. So rulers taxed it harder, or claimed the right to sell it themselves. The plan sounded simple: turn a daily necessity into guaranteed revenue, but it shifted pressure onto ordinary households. In France, that pressure took a famous form: the gabelle, a state salt tax that reached deep into daily life. People did not just pay more, they faced rules on how much salt they had to buy, where they had to buy it, and what happened if they avoided the official price. Regions paid different rates, so the same mineral felt like a punishment in one place and a bargain in another. Smuggling spread fast. As enforcement tightened, the tax stopped feeling like a policy and started feeling like domination. House searches, seizures, fines, and prison did not only target criminals, they touched families trying to preserve food and survive winter. Resentment built because salt made the inequality visible day after day, meal after meal. When people later questioned royal power, they carried memories of salt collectors and the state's hand in their kitchens. In British-ruled India, salt stopped being just food and became law. The colonial government tightened control over making and selling it, then charged a tax that hit everyone, every day. People living near the sea could not freely collect what lay on their own shoreline. Local producers faced bans and penalties. A basic necessity turned into a guaranteed stream of revenue enforced by police and courts. That pressure created an opening for a different kind of protest. Mohandas Gandhi chose salt because it touched every household and required no special education to understand. In 1930, he led the Salt March from inland to the coast, turning a long walk into a moving campaign. Each mile gathered more followers. The message stayed simple. Breaking the salt law meant challenging the right of an empire to tax survival. When marchers reached the sea and made salt in open defiance, the act looked small but landed hard. Ordinary people copied it across the country, not with weapons, but with repeated public law-breaking. The authorities answered with arrests and force, and the confrontation spread far beyond salt. The tax had been designed to control daily life. Now it mobilized it. A common mineral became a mass political tool on the road to independence. By the time the modern age arrived, the old problem of salt scarcity started to break. Industry scaled everything. Mines went deeper, pumps and rails moved heavy loads, and factories boiled brine without stopping. Salt no longer depended on a dry season, a caravan, or a guarded coast. It flowed through national transport networks like any other bulk material. The price fell. For the first time, most people lived as if salt never ran out. That abundance created a new kind of risk. Salt stopped being mainly a supply problem and became a consumption problem. Processed foods relied on it for flavor and shelf life, and daily intake rose without people noticing. The damage appeared slowly. Higher blood pressure, more heart disease, more strokes. Governments responded with health campaigns, nutrition labels, and targets for manufacturers. The fight moved from smugglers and tax collectors to doctors, regulators, and food companies. The contrast stayed stark. In the past, whoever controlled salt controlled survival. They fed armies, held cities, taxed trade, and tightened power over ordinary life. A shortage could topple order. In the present, salt sat on every table, cheap enough to ignore, and the struggle turned into managing excess. States still reached into the salt supply, but now to limit harm, not to ration life. The mineral remained political, only the pressure changed.